Britain's £1.4 billion spy drones programme has been branded an unmitigated disaster by one MP after a report revealed the drones struggle to work in poor weather conditions. None of the so-called watchkeeper drones are believed to be out on operations, despite costing £5 million each. The machines are based on an Israeli craft, but have been so extensively modified that some are too heavy to fly. 8 of the drones have reportedly been written off at a cost of £40 million. Joining me to discuss this in the studio is security expert Will Geddes, and down the line is former Army officer and defence analyst Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Crawford. Lieutenant Colonel, let me start with you first. Just explain to people who are coming new to this story how on earth we could have ended up with such a load of dud drones.
Well, I mean, that is the $60 million question, Daisy. And I'm afraid to say it's the latest in a long line, a litany, if you like, of fairly disastrous British Army or British Armed Services equipment procurement programs which have come unstuck. Now, we know that the watchkeeper is based on the Israeli drone, I think it's called the Hertz or something like that, which has been used successfully for many years. But there is a thing which people like me refer to called British exceptionalism. And that means that we seem to be unable to look at other people's military equipment and say, oh, that's a nice bit of kit, we'll have that, without imposing many, many, many alterations and differences, which inevitably lead to an increase in cost. And in the case of the watchkeeper, it would appear a fall-off in performance. It's an old story, it continues year on year, and no political party seems to be able or willing to tackle it.
Well, Stuart, let me just pick you up on this exceptionalism element that you're talking about. Is what you're saying that we don't like taking stuff off the shelf, we like it to be sort of haute couture for our defence forces, and therefore we tinker and play and add and end up ruining it? Or is it, I mean, does it come from a sense of superiority, or what's it all about? Why can't we just accept what other people have got?
I don't know. I mean, we used to talk about a thing called not invented here syndrome in the military, and it applies to other areas of life as well. But not just the watchkeeper drone, which seems to have worked perfectly well for the Israelis, although I'm only using the same open sources accounts as everybody else. But we also have another procurement disaster, the daddy of them all, which is the Ajax armoured reconnaissance vehicle. Again, based on an existing design called the ASCOD, used by the Spanish and Austrian armed forces. And yet, coming into British service, it has been hugely delayed, hugely over budget, and doesn't work. Well, until recently, it didn't work. And that's because we insist on modifications and changes to design on almost every occasion.
Well, help me out here. Why do we insist on modifying to death, literally?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, Stuart's absolutely right. Some of it can come down to the fact that they want to adapt it for particular theatres of operation, and it may be in certain circumstances inclement weather, which in this particular instance seems to have failed desperately, because one of the things that I've certainly seen with the procurement process of the MOD is they'll purchase weapons or munitions or equipment that can be deployed in territories where it's manufactured, which could be very sort of warm, very high temperature environments, which are in otherwise quite dry, and then be deployed into environments where it's sub-zero temperatures, it could be rain, there could be sleet, there could be all sorts of aspects. I mean, it's the old leaves on the train line, if you like, to a certain extent. So some of the, as Stuart says, it's some of the modifications that are done, which can then add to the bill. It then makes it obviously incredibly more expensive than the off-the-shelf product. But the thing that really defies logic is that we look at the actual use of drones, UAVs, quadcopters, in various different theatres of operation right now, and many of these are actually off the shelf. And I know certainly many military forces around the world will buy consumer drones and then adapt them at far lesser cost than they do going to a major aerospace defence organisation like Lockheed, for example.
So let's talk about drones and how important they are in modern warfare. Obviously, we've heard a lot about drones in the Russia-Ukraine battlefield, the attacks on the cargo ships by the Houthi rebels. You know, my understanding was a lot of those, if not all, were done by drones. I'm guessing there are lots of different types of drones, and there are more expensive and inexpensive, but they've obviously been used by other people quite successfully.
Yeah, very, very successfully. I mean, for example, in the Ukraine-Russian conflict right now, since the beginning of the war, there's been over 4,500 drones which have been deployed to carry out advanced reconnaissance, to find out enemy positions, and even been used to deploy IEDs, for example, improvised explosive devices, or munitions of various sorts. That has created a real complex theatre of operation, certainly for Ukraine in their defensive positions, but Ukraine equally have also been deploying many of these UAVs for their own purposes and for doing exactly the same. Now, most of the ones that I've certainly seen, and certainly from my own teams that have been down there, they have been very much the consumer types. DJI, which is a very, very large manufacturer of consumer drones across the world, based in China. Many of them are those devices. And what they've done is they've actually adapted them, as have the Houthis, using them in the Red Sea. And the Red Sea, for example, within a period of 4 hours, deployed about 600 drones against some of the ships and some of the carriers which were actually in the Red Sea at the time. So, and that's been done at a very, very low cost. I mean, you can look at probably some of the most advanced technology with thermal cameras. You're looking at about $10,000 for a piece of kit. And then you look at the bill that the MOD has been footing for their devices and their inability to be able to be utilised for their purposes.
Stuart, let me talk to you about this subject from a military perspective, but looking at it from a slightly broader issue. In that, there has been a lot spoken and written about in the last few months about the size of the military. You know, can fit our British military into Twickenham Stadium, that we're down to 70,000 or whatever it is. And many people have said that that's been a trend that has come from the MOD for the last decade or two, where they've said, we don't need boots on ground. What we need is toys, we need technology, we need all the gadgets and gizmos, and we can do away with the humans. Do you think in some ways that's gone too far now? And that's why we've seen A, too few boots on the ground, and B, too much investment in some technology that simply doesn't work?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes and yes. All the modern gizmos and things that do wonderful things are important, and we should invest in them sensibly, arguably not as we have done in the Protector drone, but sensibly, and get value for money. But if one lesson has come out of the conventional European war in Ukraine, is that you need lots of stuff, because warfare is attritional. And sadly, you lose things. You lose equipment. Even more sadly, you lose people. And that's always been the way of warfare. So we need to have lots and lots of stuff. So it's not a case of either or, which I think some politicians have fallen into the trap of saying we don't need a battalion because we've got 12 drones, which is just utter nonsense, because they do different things and have different capabilities. And that's the mindset that we have to overcome. The other problem is, Daisy, and everybody has said it for years gone by, is that there are no votes in defence. And other priorities prevail in government until the enemy are at the gates. And they're not at the gates yet, thank goodness, but they're getting closer.
Yeah, absolutely right, isn't it? What Stuart's saying there. I mean, we've got the drones, therefore we don't need that battalion. Yeah. I've heard lots of people over the years say that from the MOD, and now it's coming back to bite us. And B, this almost more important issue, there are no votes in defence again until when it's right on our doorstep.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few areas to unpick of what Stuart covered there, and some of which I'd agree with, some of which I wouldn't necessarily agree with wholeheartedly. The first of which is obviously our defence spending is woefully inadequate, and I think in terms of the enemy being at our gates, I think they're actually inside the gates right now, and we've got to look at some very serious considerations in what we do in our deployment of assets and resources, particularly with the military. But going beyond that, in terms of technology and its application within a theatre of war, one of the biggest challenges at the moment is a battalion and actual physical manpower is absolutely critical. And I agree with Stuart on that. But the Ukrainians, for example, have had to adapt their strategies because some of these particular UAVs, particularly racing drones, which are super fast, they're very difficult to take out. You can't literally shoot them out of the sky because they move too quickly. And they are uncovering or discovering Ukraine positions, which have meant that the Ukrainians have to now move at night because unless there is thermal imagery, obviously with those cameras, it's very easy for the Russians to see and then direct artillery into their position. So it kind of goes hand in hand. And as warfare is always the case, it's evolving on a constant basis. Yeah. And technology becomes even more important.
And it will be fascinating. We know there'll be an election this year. It will be fascinating to see if defence finally goes up the political agenda, as I think all three of us believe it should. Whether or not it will, we'll have to wait and see. Stuart Crawford and Will Geddes, thank you very much.